Welcome to today's webinar on obtaining value from your database activity monitoring solution. My name is Phil Ruman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrigy, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. Today's speaker is Mike Miller, and assisted by Steve Coast, actually. Mike is the Vice President and Chief Security Officer of Integrigy and is responsible for Integrigy's security assessment services. For the past 16 years, Michael has been focused exclusively on Oracle's e-business suite and has sat on Oracle's Customer Advisory Board for Security and Oracle's On Demand. I'll now turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Phil, and good afternoon, everyone. Today's topic here is database activity monitoring. We will be starting with a few brief comments in and around database security, and then kind of not spend that much time, but we do want to go through database activity monitoring solutions and how they work, and then break down really what we're here for today is talking about how to obtain value from your solution. We're going to first talk to some tactical issues when we get into that part of the conversation, and then we'll round out the conversation with some strategic points and then take questions at the end. This is an educational webinar, so we won't dwell on it, but we do want to just help those of you who are not familiar with Integrigy orient yourselves as far as who we are, what we do. We have two main lines of business, products and services. The services side, of which I spend most of my time with, is in and around building solutions to help secure information within databases, not just with assessment services, but thinking through the compliance angles. And much of what we do and find and work with as far as these solutions and conversations with clients also gets repackaged into our product line with regard to App Sentry and App Defend. These are two purpose-built tools for assisting with database security. So with that, let's move on to the conversation at hand here. Security. Whether or not we're talking about database security or physical security or any element of security, security is a process. With regard to database security here, really want to stress the point that no one tool, be it database activity monitoring solutions, is going to secure you, right? So it is a holistic approach, and we need to think through it as that first and foremost. Just to underscore that a little bit more, when we sit down with our clients and start thinking about database security programs, these are the components that we stress that all need to be in place as far as the topic here today with regard to auditing, monitoring, but almost really of equal weight. Each component here needs to be thought through. There are interdependencies here. So the boxes in red are what we are highlighting here today as far as the database activity monitoring, but please note the interrelationships among these components, not only as far as the planning, the implementation, and ongoing, but also where you would start to build out your database security program. So again, we'll to make some additional comments with regard to database activity monitoring here, that the interrelated disciplines of alerting, monitoring, and auditing are all related, but they're separate, right? And so there's dependencies. We're going to be talking a little bit about that today. The requirements are difficult, right? Because they are multidiscipline, right? This is the intersection of the compliance requirements, which sometimes are more coming out of the legal realm, into the operational aspects of supporting a database from the DBA team, and then overlaid that with the applications, sometimes very large applications such as the Oracle e-business suite, SAP, PeopleSoft, etc. The challenge, though, here is that the information for which database activity monitoring solutions are put in place to generate. They need to generate questions. They need to generate action, right? So what is the basis of action? So most organizations, we find when we first start sitting down to talk with them about their initial thoughts for how to go about implementing a database activity monitoring solution, or they have already had one and they want to take it to the next level, or want to help us, they want to have us help them with an additional component. What we usually see far too often, though, is the situation here where there's a zero value add, right? That an implementation has been, a box has been checked for compliance, and what's coming out is a poor value, or nobody's looking at the outputs whatsoever. We'll get into this, but an example of a low value add could be with regard to an application such as the Oracle e-business suite or even PeopleSoft, that when the application logs on, to actually track each logon, of which in the background there could be literally tens of thousands of logons a day for a large application. That's low value. High value would be an example of direct database logons to such a database, or even better, direct database logons, someone coming in through the back door, looking, and the expiry rules for the database activity monitoring solution could potentially be looking for, hey, let's look at direct database connections where somebody is pulling back from Toad or SQL Plus, let's say 1,000, 10,000, or maybe 100,000 social security numbers, right? So something that was, it's high value information that is unusual. Database activity monitoring solutions, how do they work? So this is a solution slide from Guardium that I put in because I really thought it told the story very nicely as far as the heterogeneous applications that are supported by the solution, and the fact that we have the application servers, we have the database servers here, and then these agents that are installed on the database servers themselves are reporting back to the Guardium collectors, right? So most database activity monitoring solutions work this way with the with an agent that's deployed on the database server that's reporting back through its infrastructure. Key points here as far as what database activity monitoring solutions provide. They are looking across all your database platforms, be it Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, Teradata. They're not reliant upon the native database audit logs. So this allows you to put out a single lens, for example, to look at all your database, a single security lens to look at all your database activity, and to do so in such a way through these agents such that it's a minimal performance impact. Really what these agents are doing are just copying network packets and relaying them out to the collector architecture. The advantage of this is that there's no, not only with the minimal performance impact, but a very no impact to the, no configuration changes required to the database, or more importantly to the application. Another advantage of the database activity monitoring solutions is that they offer a separation of duties. So the DBAs or privileged users who have full access to all the sensitive data in these in the target databases. If we're talking about native auditing, the DBAs might or might not be able to audit, or might or might not be able to alter the native database audit logs. The advantage with the database activity monitoring solution is that those audit logs have been removed off the target servers and placed in the Guardium collectors, placed in the collectors such that there is a division of duties. A different explanation of database activity monitoring solutions, if that was Guardium, here is the Oracle Audit Vault and Database Firewall, and I just included this because I want to show how this works. It's a little different in that the agents are consuming the native audit logs that are coming out of, you can see up in the upper right there, the Oracle, MySQL, SQL Server, and feeding that into the Audit Vault, which is the primary appliance here. And you can see the end user activity that is triggering various audit events to go off. That information is then pulled into the Audit Vault server where reporting, alerting, and correlation can occur. As far as the key vendors in this space here, Imperva, IBM, Oracle, and McAfee are what we commonly see out there. Most of these, as far as the bottom three, are acquisitions. As far as IBM, about 5 years ago, bought Guardium. Oracle acquired the Sereno, and then McAfee bought Centrigo there. And from those of you who are registered for today's webinar, it does look like we got a handful of, as far as those of you who reported what you're using, we got a handful of each one of these on the slide here. Bear in mind too that database activity monitoring solutions do more than just monitor. They have been built out certainly over the last few releases for each one of the products in the prior slide there. They're doing more, right? So they have now the ability to block as far as a SQL statement, let's say, from a certain user or a certain time of day, or maybe a certain user that can't see social security numbers, right? You can actually build out policies that would block. Also the ability to, on the same variation there, to actually the results that coming back from a database to actually then mask, right? They have the ability to go out and inventory, not just find databases on the network, but also crawl those databases and potentially look through the dictionaries for content for data that looks like and appears to be, for example, a social security number or a credit card. They also have vulnerability scanning, right, as far as secure configurations of the database, and also then change auditing. Not all the products do every one of these, but certainly the products are heading in this space here as far as being able to do more of what you see here. So how to attain value? Right, so set the table as far as what a database activity monitoring tool can do. Talk a little bit about the vendors in the space, and whether or not you have a DAM solution in place here today, or you're thinking about implementing one shortly here. What I want to do with you here now is kind of take you through the tactical steps of how to go about implementing it. What are the questions that what are the questions that should be asked? And so whether or not you're thinking of getting more value out of it, some of the questions might help you with that as far as getting more out of your current implementation, or certainly get you on a good straight and narrow path here to start thinking about how to get started. So with that, planning, pilot, and production, right? And we'll break these down in turn. First and foremost, and this is really probably if any, there's a few key slides in this deck here, and this is one of the more important ones, as far as who's going to own what, as far as the support model. Again, I was foreshadowing earlier that the database activity monitoring solutions really sit at the intersection of many different disciplines, right? And it's unique in that respect, and such that the ownership issues are a little bit more challenging. I'll break that down in the next slide. But then, of equal importance, though, who's going to be monitoring, right? Who's going to be looking at the information coming out? What decisions are they being asked to make? And really not, how well are you integrating the output, the information generated by your database activity monitoring solution into your security fabric? Who owns what? So if we look across the three columns here, we have our infrastructure, database activity monitoring administration in the center, and then the DAM consumer on the right. So what we mean by the infrastructure is as far as the initial install of the appliances and the agents, right? And then there's the configuration in the middle there, and that's really split between, we split that between the functional and the technical as far as who's responsible for the care and feeding of the technical solution, right, and then on up into who's designing the policies. The arrows there you see going back and forth with the consumers of the information, though. Here are the disciplines that we were talking about, as far as the internal audit, the security, and the DBA teams. As far as, and the challenge here is, let's say when that event occurs, that a new database user has been created, or a user has been granted a privilege, maybe a high security privilege, such as the ability to create other users, or to view any table or read any table. These type of events, then once they're captured, we need to feed that back into who can make a decision about that. And we see a lot of people struggle this initially, that they might go through the implementation and they might have things stood up, but they didn't really break this down as far as who owns what part of the life cycle. As when we get to it, the bottom line here with regard to any database activity monitoring solution is this, is that the initial design and installation is rather straightforward. The real challenge here, and really what we challenge people to think about, is this 80%. This is why you implemented this, because you are in need of the monitoring, the alerting, and the reporting, and that is where 80% of the long-term effort needs to occur, right? This is where the eyes and the resources of the organization need to be invested, as far as what are they doing with that information that's coming out. So how to get going in the right way, as far as to address both those two concerns there. So what we usually recommend people to do is to deploy the infrastructure, get those basic appliances out, get a test or lab environment set up, and really think about putting together a run book to install the agents on each platform. And by that I mean Oracle, Sybase, if you have variations of AIX and Linux and Windows, make sure that your lab environment has one of each, and make sure that you have the freedom to not only just create test transactions, but also potentially with some of the agents you need to execute bounces of the database services. And to really have access to that, I think you're going to find that if you have those run books created, you're going to be in a position to really not only support long-term much easier, but also implement much faster, right? And with that, focus on the basics first. So all of the products that I mentioned earlier there, they have a very rich set of out-of-the-box policies. And, hopefully I'm respectful to, if anybody's in sales for one of those products on today's webinar here, they create a lot of value, but at the same time, there's a little bit of what I like to talk about as far as a science experiment, as far as you got the picture frame, you need to take your own picture and create the value. So with that, in your lab environment, explore those out-of-the-box policies, that not only just for Oracle or SQL Server events, but potentially also for PeopleSoft or SAP. All of them have pre-built solutions for HIPAA, PCI, and SOX, but that you will find that many of these pre-built solutions are really lists or named lists, but when you click on the contents of the list there, they're blank. That's because you need to do the configuration. Once the configuration is done, then yes, you do have a solution that will help you on the way to meeting your SOX or PCI compliance. The point here, though, is that we would highly suggest that you keep all of the other, we'll say, additional functionality for blocking and masking, and certainly alert forwarding to your SIM, be it QRadar or ArcSight or Splunk. Keep that off at this stage here, because you really want to focus on just getting the agents installed. There is functionality for artificial intelligence or learning or Bayesian outlier detection, turn that on. Just a quick aside with what I'm talking about there is many of these tools now have the ability to learn about your database. Let's say over the course of 4 weeks or 6 weeks, they will observe the activity and being able to, through the statistical sampling, start to pinpoint activity that could be inordinate. For example, that user has never logged on the weekend, or that user, when it does appear as a log on, let's say it never asked for social security numbers, right? And so you can start to build out a statistical model. These artificial intelligence or Bayesian statistics, it's very powerful, but at the same time, there is a learning there is a learning curve that the machine itself needs, and then you need to train it. I'll talk about that in a moment. But at least for the initial phase here, what we're asking people to think about first is focus on the basics first, leave the learning off, and really focus on what we believe is a basic set of database events. So I'll speak to this tactically here. Steve is going to take it a little further later on in the conversation here today. But we suggest that once you get those initial, infrastructure stood up, and you have the agents rolled out in your sandbox, to then implement our framework for database auditing and logging. What we see as far as the out-of-the-box policies for all these tools are way too generic, right, as far as creating value, right? And so we have put together a holistic set of events, and we've mapped these out to PCI and HIPAA. Steve will talk about this a little bit more, but we suggest that you put that in first, and then within your lab environment here, go through and create the test transactions, and make sure that you take those test transactions on each platform. Because what you want to do is you want to be able to then be able to stand in front of your management team and say, okay, yes, we're ready to proceed. If you've already gone through that and are thinking about ways to increase value, really what we've done with our framework here, and I put the slide in, Steve will again take it a little further, as far as you want to think about a layered approach to the policy rules, as far as common events, compliance events, and then per database. By this we would mean per platform, SQL Server to Oracle to MySQL. And you want to look at the policies events as far as the lens in which you might be looking down into a few hundred or maybe a few thousand assets, with it's a common lens as far as what events are indicative, or let's say, that will allow you to see the ripples in the water of, let's say, some sort of a security event, right? We then try to take people through, and if you don't have that or lens or such a way of looking at your policies, we like to then pull that into a common template here as far as what are the rules, and then how is that information, when it's triggered, how is it then used, right? And you can see here as far as what's the alert or report, and then what compliance requirements are being met through that. So just kind of a helpful hint here as far as ways of organizing, and also to communicate up the chain as far as if you have an external or an internal auditor, this is usually a good way of putting in front of them the simple one slide. Here's what we have. Here's what our database activity monitoring solution is doing. So at this point in time, we've stood something up. We're still in the lab. You've developed a test set of policies, and you're ready to go in front of management and talk about opening up change tickets to roll out agents. Commonly, this underestimated as far as particularly the number of agents that can be rolled out. And the 60 to 100, kind of threw that together, is kind of a safe average. How strong your run books are together and how well tested they are, you could probably go a little higher. But the fact is that it will take time to roll out those agents. While you are rolling out those agents throughout your organization, again, if you have 2,000 or 3,000 assets, it will take time. And you need to think about the best way to roll that out. And while you're rolling that out, you're beginning to, you're stepped outside the, the clean environments of your test environment, and you want to think about how you're going to digest reality, right? And so taking time out and acknowledging in your professional services, if you're securing the professional services to help you with this process, this is really where the biggest value is going to get, as far as this initial few weeks or a few months where you're tuning those initial policies to your reality. Likewise, you're dispelling any fears about to the DBAs or system administrators about really what the performance impact of those agents are. As far as also within the change management within the organization here, we were still initially trying to encourage people to keep those alert relaying off, right? So while you're tuning those initial policies, all right, and you get to a point where you're comfortable with that, you probably don't need to overly, let's say, excite your 24/7 monitoring team that's with a lot of relaying via syslog out, for example, to Splunk or ArcSight or QRadar. And we say that because once you've tuned those policies, it's only then that you're ready to make some concrete statements with regard to what it is the information is coming out and who needs to do what with that, right? So going back to those two initial statements I was making as far as who owns what and then who's monitoring, right? Because these run books that are really, it's at the tail end of the implementation, but they're really the most important step as far as the keystone that pulls it all together. Once you get those run books together, then you can start thinking about alert relay and turning that on. It's also probably the best time to start thinking about your backup and archiving of the information being generated by your database activity monitoring solution. Once you're, quote, live, some things to think about then, as far as you got the basics in place, then you could start thinking about sensitive data and logging, masking, and blocking. By this, most of the tools, actually all the tools, give you a means to, let's say, set up a policy, not just for the questions, set up rules of not just the questions being asked of the database, but also look at the results, the answers coming back from the database. For example, you might set up a series of rules that are indicative of somebody trying to break into the database, right, as far as what error messages are being thrown, or potentially somebody being elevated and getting a privilege to read all or any table. And while that might be concerning in and of itself, what might be very concerning is a direct database logon that could be, for example, bringing back 50, 60,000 social security numbers in the middle of the night, right? So those expiry rules, those rules in and around the information coming out of the database, by looking at those result sets through usually it's either a combination of regular expressions or fine grain auditing, you can set that up. But we're saying, look at that can generate an incredible amount of value. We get the basics in first. Last but not least, just going back to the Bayesian outliers, I was saying each one of these tools that offers that really needs a number of weeks of observation before it can start making, before it'll start displaying results. But as much as during the sales process, the sales team might get you excited about the capability of this, the fact of the matter is that someone has to train the models, right? So if you have thousands of assets, you have to think about all of the outlier points that are being observed, and that a human is then needed to go in and train the model by saying, yes, that's normal, or no, that requires additional scrutiny. I call that, probably dating myself here as far as my video games here, but who is going to play Pac-Man with those dots, right? And so going back to that support model, as far as you might need an FTE or 1.5 FTEs to maintain the infrastructure, and not just of the appliances, but also the care and feeding of all the agents. But then you also really need to think about what is the impact on your security team as far as who's responsible for the information. So if they're also going to be responsible for training the artificial intelligence, factor that into your decision making. So with that, I think now I'm going to turn this over to Steve Coast. And Steve, you will talk to us about a little bit more about the strategic and other steps that can be taken.
Thanks so much, Mike. So up to this point, Mike talked about how to get value going through the implementation process, some of the key features that you can do. What I'm going to do now is delve into more of the policy creation, how you're going to take this activity stream, this stream of SQL statements coming in, and actually make use of it, turn it into actionable information, do something with it, integrate this within your security program so you're taking that stream of potentially incidents, non-compliance events, and turning it into a workflow. How are auditors going to deal with this information? What are you going to do with IT security and things like that? So we're going to walk through that in the next few slides, and how to get value out of your database activity monitoring solution by putting in the right policies and making use of it. These tools do a very good job of capturing SQL statements, but what they do at the end of the day is capture SQL statements. That is not a business transaction. When you're looking at some of the activity captured by a database activity monitoring solution, or just any database auditing, fundamentally at the end of the day, it's still just a SQL statement. Someone has to be knowledgeable enough to make a determination of what that information is. And our goal is to try to take that SQL statement and say, okay, this is kind of related to a business event, and we're going to try to do something with it. And that may be raise an alert into your security monitoring. It may be creating a report that's being sent off to your auditors, things like that. So what do you need, like an auditing framework? Mike brought this up earlier, is these tools come with lots of policies out of the box and things like that. Unfortunately, most of what's in the box is just a bunch of reports and policies that don't fit well together. It hasn't been thought through from start to end. It's like, oh, you can do this, and it's very generic, generalized for many, many different customers of these solutions. What we've done at Integrigy is try to think through is, how do you get the best value? What do you really need to be looking at? What's important? What defines an incident? What defines an event that would be a violation? And so Integrigy has come up with a framework for database auditing, and it's much more than just a framework. It's really a methodology, and how should you be looking at this information? What should you be doing with it? We're not only identifying that, well, it should be logged. Then we start to the point where it's, well, no, it should be alerted. It should be reported on. This is where it should potentially go. And it's really a good starting point. It gives you a good foundation of where potentially you want to go after this. So what we've done is actually taken a lot of the different compliance standards like PCI, SOX, HIPAA, and actually mapped those out to say, okay, for a database, what are some of the key events that you might want to look at? What do those compliance and security standards say that you should be looking at in terms of like logins, logoffs, account creation, privilege usage, those type of things? And we've mapped that into a really comprehensive framework. We've also done this for certain applications like Oracle Business Suite, because then in that case you also have application audit trails going on. And then what do you do with this information once you've gotten it? So in terms of the database auditing solution itself, that's just the blue box on the left that says database. there we're just capturing the information. The key here is there's a lot of effort and work that needs to be done outside of just capturing the information. What do you want to do with it? Where should you put it? How should you handle the information? So the foundation and how we approached this was, okay, what are some of the key security and compliance events? What are these actions that you need to look at? And so then we've mapped those out and looked at them and said, okay, as an example, logins. Well, there's a lot of different things that we can do with login information. So then we take that login information and say, okay, how do we differentiate it if it's potentially an authorized or potentially malicious login? What are characteristics of malicious logins? As an example, in Oracle database, there's a number of seeded accounts such as CTX-sys, MD-sys. Those accounts are very seldom ever logged into, and really only time they're ever logged into is from the database server. Very seldom should an application ever use that. Well, it's a clear indication of a potential attack, because if I'm going to go after an Oracle database, I'm going to take an account like CTX-sys, which often has a default password of CTX-sys, and try to log in. So in terms of our login security events, we're now trying to take that login and say, okay, what do we know about logins? What can we actually make some assumptions and say, well, a login to CTX-sys, that's probably a high-risk security event. We need to send that off. But maybe a login just from a standard application user works. This is where we also try to integrate in with the DAM solutions, Bayesian logic, outlier detection. That will then capture that information and say, okay, what's all our population of logins from application servers, what account are they using, those type of things. Then how about unsuccessful login? So then we're looking at these different things, user creation. And so not only are we just saying, okay, we're going to capture user creation, we're going to now try to model that user creation out. Where should my users be created? I may have a system like ITIM that automatically creates user accounts for the databases. Well, if I'm creating users not through that system, wouldn't that be a high-risk event? So those are the type of things that we're looking at. We're trying to map this out, and we start with a good framework to say these are the things that we need to look at that are important in the environment and these key security events. And then this is really a maturity model. So this is the first step. This is what we think you should do walking in the door. Then we start talking about, okay, how do we extend it? When do we start talking about sensitive data and things like that? But this is the foundation. This is a very good starting point that you can implement right away that says, okay, these are the things I want to look at. These are where the alert should go. This is what I should be thinking about for each of these. And we've mapped each of these events back to some of the compliance standards. So we've mapped it back to PCI, SOX, and COBIT and said, okay, this is where this requirement comes from. The biggest challenge we often get with our clients is, well, we should do that, we should do that. We always want to map it back to something. We always want to say, why are you capturing this information? Why is it important to the organization? What requirement is it satisfying in terms of security or compliance? Because a lot of people just capture a lot of information to capture it. You've got a nice shiny tool now. Oh, we can just capture everything. But they don't think through, okay, why am I capturing it? What should I do with it? Why is it important? What objectives is it fulfilling it for the business at the end of the day? And that's the key. It's now trying to take each of these policies that you're creating, each of the capture points, trying to do something with the information, make it actionable, make it useful to the organization, turn that just stream of SQL statements into alerts, reports that you're trying to automate within the organization and solve problems. So that's kind of the foundation, the framework. So those are things that you can capture. Then there's a number of things you can do within the DAM solutions that actually now start solving real-life problems and solving limitations. Unfortunately, the DAM solution can't do it all alone. So now you've just implemented a shiny new tool. You're capturing information. But unfortunately, you do have to make some changes to the organizations, to the workflow processes. One of the things that we love to implement, we can get a lot of value out of, is doing change ticket tracking. All the tools out of the box have this capability, but unfortunately you do have to make some other changes. So not only is it enabling it within the DAM solution, now we have to start working with the DBAs and some applications. And I'll use Oracle Create User as an example. So one of the things we want to do at the end of the day, and we see this in a lot of organizations, that they need to track user creation. And then the auditors come in and say, okay, you created 100 users in the last quarter. Where did those users come from? I want to see basically the change control on that user creation. Who authorized that user creation? And what happens is the DBAs or someone has to go through and now track down and find the ticket number for each of those. Well, the DAM solutions can do this in a very automated way and give you a lot of value. And typically how we set this up is, first thing we do is we make a process change for the DBAs. So if the DBAs are manually creating users, well, what we can do is have them execute a SQL statement prior to the creation of the user, which then adds that ticket number to the stream that the DAM solution is actually capturing. And then we'll tag that user creation with that ticket number. That becomes very powerful. We've had one client who had an automated solution that was doing this. One line of code changed to that application, so every time that application automatically created database accounts, it passed along the ticket number. So then when we look at number 2 here in the DAM solution, now we've got a create user event. So here we're creating the user Scott, but now we've actually tied a ticket number to it. So we know that Bob, the DBA, created it, but we also know that when he created it, he used ticket number 1, 2, 3, 4. So then in the DAM solution, we're creating 2 reports. One report is the user creation for authorized. When it's authorized, in our definition of authorized was somebody passed in a ticket number. And then we also create a second report that's user creation unauthorized. Again, somehow a user is created with no ticket number. That could have been a hacker broke in, was creating a user. It could have been potentially just a DBA that was out of policy who created a user without actually doing the ticket number. And that unauthorized creation, we could actually even create alerts. We could send an alert immediately, an email alert to the DBA manager, an email alert to the security monitoring team, things like that. And then the final piece here, number 3, is we're actually then changing the auditor process. So the auditors used to come in and just say, okay, show me all the users created, and they would look at it. Now we can actually enhance that process and give them the 2 reports. One is the user creation that's authorized. Then the auditors can basically just sample through that, maybe 100 users. They pick 2 or 3 to verify that the ticket numbers are correct and that the users were actually created in an authorized manner, that the change control process worked appropriately, there's appropriate sign-offs. But then we also have the unauthorized user creation, and often what we do with that report is we go through every single violation and determine what happened, why was that done, is a problem. This process actually works fairly well with the Oracle E-Business Suite, because what we've found is the Oracle E-Business Suite creates users in the background when you're doing upgrades or applying major patches. One of the key problems with that user creation is it actually creates users with default passwords. When we implemented this process for some clients, we've all of a sudden, they were catching like, oh my gosh, Oracle E-Business Suite created a user we didn't know about. And as soon as the DA manager was receiving that weekly email of unauthorized user creation, they were saying, hey, why are these users getting created? Are you doing password controls around these users? And what ended up happening was very clearly that they created 10 or 20 users based on just patching. And they had default passwords, and they were able to very quickly fix that IT security hole, that they created users. No one knew about why they were created, but it was just based on Oracle E-Business Suite doing patching. So this process now becomes very powerful. But again, this is implementing a DAM solution, but it's also working through the workflow processes on both sides, from the DBAs to the auditors, to actually make a full loop here to say, okay, now we're trying to add value. We're minimizing the time the DBAs are required to review and provide information to the auditors. The auditors are actually looking and getting much better information than they ever were before, and it's very easy for them just to go sample some tickets, go look at the unauthorized user creation, and the goal at the end of the day is get that unauthorized user creation down to 0, and that's very feasible. So this is an example of change ticket tracking. You can do this with many different things. I just picked a create user example because it's very easy. It's very easy to understand the workflow. But you can do this with many, many different things, object creation, all kinds of different options. Another significant problem with DAM solutions is the generic user problem. Because typically what happens either in applications or just the way the DBAs access the system, and we even get clients that say, oh no, this is not how it works, and as soon as you implement the solution, you start capturing audit trails, it becomes very apparent. Because what happens is, and this works for applications, but it can also just work for the manual DBA logging in, you have the name DBA, and he SSHs into the database server. He connects the Oracle account. Well, that's generic user, and then he does a SQL plus from that Oracle session into the database. The problem here is then what either the native database auditing or the DAM solution will capture is, well, system, the DB user system connected from the Oracle account on the database server, ran SQL plus and created a user. Based on some compliance requirements and security requirements, that's not very good information. I have no idea who really did that. what DBA did that. I might have a DBA team of 100 people that have access to the box, and I have no idea. Hopefully somebody didn't compromise the system and Oracle account. I don't know that here. I don't know who actually connected. So here's another significant problem. We see this quite often where organizations have implemented a database activity monitoring solution, is they all of a sudden start getting this data and they're like, oh my gosh, we don't know what's happening. What can we do about this? And these solutions have actually very good capabilities to fix this problem. So tools like Imperva and Guardium have generic user tracking. So they can actually take the information. So when someone does a SU or sudo on a database server, they can actually capture that chain information. So if I do a SU 20 times, they capture that information. So now we actually have to change both DBA process and potentially the login to the server process. So now instead of the DBA SHing into the Oracle account, they're forced either by policy or by restrictions actually on the database server that they now have to SH into their named account. Again, our DBA is named Bob. So now Bob has to SSH into a named account Bob. Based on the way Oracle works and a lot of the databases work, I still have to use that Oracle account, especially like on like an Oracle Business Suite environment. I can't do my work as Bob. I can't go SQL Plus in as system. I really need to be in as Oracle to make everything work right. A lot of things I have to do. Potentially for the create user problem, I can get around that. But many, many times the DBAs actually have to use these generic accounts. But now I've solved that problem. So I SSH in as Bob. I SU to Oracle. Then I still do my SQL Plus to system. So steps 2 and 3 are the same. I'm still using the Oracle and system accounts. The only change I've made is now I'm going in as Bob initially. Now with the user tracking feature, I capture the exact same information, but I have one more piece of information, is this OS user chain, which is basically Bob transitioned to Oracle. So now I know at the end of the day, the Oracle user was really authorized as Bob to get into the box. So now I'm starting to solve some problems. I'm starting to solve this generic user tracking problem so I can actually add much better information to my audit record than previously. So these are why these solutions come in very handy, that now I can start solving these very complex problems, get back down to named DBA. The named DBA is probably the highest cost solution here, that it takes a lot of time to get this right. But at the end of the day, I need to get back to a named DBA that did something. This is the way you have to do it. And other ways I can change this, but in certain systems, in certain environments, like Oracle Business Suite, I have to go in as a system account. I can't use a named database account to actually do some of my work. I have to do it as generic accounts, and unfortunately, that's the way the applications work. A lot of people, I would love to tell the applications, no, you can't do it that way anymore, but that's the way the applications work. You're stuck with it. You have to figure out a solution like this to get around that problem, to get down to meaningful data, back down to a named DBA. Now I know who's doing what in the environment, why they're doing it. I could also merge this with my change ticket, so now I know actually Bob did it with ticket number 1234. Oops. Another solution here is application and user tracking. So similar to the way when I was going in as the DBA connecting to the system, now what about applications? So I've got my web applications out there. This may be Oracle Business Suite, PeopleSoft, SAP, might be OBIE, it may be custom web applications. I may want to know what that actually end user is doing. But most of the web applications, they run an application server as a generic account, and they connect to the database as a generic account. This example here is from Oracle Business Suite. So typically my audit record would show the database user's apps, the OS user's Apple Manager. I'm coming from a generic application server. And in this case, let's just say I'm selecting star from credit cards. Well, that's not enough information. I many times want to get back to, okay, what named user was doing this? Who connected to the application actually executed that SQL statement? Well, these tools also have the capability now to get back to an end user, so they can track back to the web application end user. So now I know that Bob was the application user actually connected. So what they do is they actually monitor the database session and watch for certain strings coming by that look like an application login. So in the case of like Oracle Business Suite, when you call the PL SQL package FND login, these tools watch for FND logins and then can map that database session, just like it's doing with change ticket numbers, to an application end user, so now I know actually who did this. We'd love to implement this feature for DBAs, and the greatest thing, the DBAs just fall over backwards. Like, this is the greatest thing, because now you can actually capture SQL errors. So typically they get the call from the help desk or someone, oh, Bob, the end user is getting some SQL errors. I have no idea what's going on, because when they look at the database, yeah, I see SQL errors, but I can't map the SQL errors back to an end user. Well, if you actually implement a DEM solution, you can actually now capture back to the end user what SQL errors are occurring. So that's not a security-related event, but now you're actually doing something that provides value to the DBAs. That's always important in implementation. So again, these are just features now that you can now add more very meaningful information, create this as part of your policies. You're making minor changes throughout the way it works, not just in the DAM solution, but in the workflow processes and the technologies that are connecting. But now I can add much more detail to my audit trail and make the audit trail actually useful. The key is when you just turn on some of these solutions, the audit trail is not very useful. Then there's also something called Oracle Client Identifier. So Oracle Client Identifier takes that application end user tracking in a little different direction, and depending on what solution you're implementing, like if you run Oracle Audit Vault versus doing the application user tracking before, you would actually use the Oracle Client Identifier. So this is just actually another way to accomplish the same thing. And you can actually set this very easily in many different applications. So by default, most applications out of the box do this. And if you're writing custom applications, you just have to go to your application developers and say, hey, why don't you set the end user application ID in the Oracle Client Identifier? Then our auditing tools downstream will actually pick that up and know who's executing what. And these are actually pretty powerful. You can actually set, like, for Oracle Business Suite, you can set responsibility names, locations, and things like that. We've got some case scenarios where the organization has people, let's say in China. They want to know what's kind of happening a little differently in China, so you can actually set locations and things like that, then track this in your audit data to say, okay, is something happening different in China than it is in the US? So again, these features become very powerful, but this is not out of the box. This is now where you're thinking through on how should I implement this? What am I actually looking for? What are my actual business requirements? Because if you work with the organizations, the vendors on these software packages, oh, just turn on what we have and you'll get everything you need. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. You really need to spend some time and effort going through and say, okay, these are the features, this is the data I actually need, this is what I want to do with the data, and this is why it's actually meaningful. So that was kind of a little bit of a background. So we delved into the policies on how can you get value out of the data that's being captured, how can you extend the data being captured to actually get more value out of. And those are some of the solutions, like the web application tracking, the change ticket tracking. Those are things that we see very seldom implemented in these DAM solutions, but that's where you can actually get a lot of the value out of the solution and solve some of your compliance security problems with very meaningful data. So I'll get back over to Phil to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Steve and Michael. And we have a few questions here. One of them has to do with Imperva. Imperva. The question is, how do we still need native auditing if we're also running Imperva?
Steve, do you want to answer that?
You, Mike.
Oh, so I would say there are certainly advantages as far as it's hard for me never to say no to auditing, right? So even with Imperva, there are some advantages. This probably warrants a longer conversation if you'd like to follow up with us on that. Really depends on what your current policies are today and some of your requirements.
All right, another question. This says we are using a DAM solution with EBS, but are getting too much apps activity from the application itself. How can this be filtered out?
I can take that. So actually have solved this for a number of clients a few different ways. And this is a perfect example of low value. I think I referred to that earlier in the presentation, as far as you don't want to trap each and every single time someone connects as apps, right? Especially if they're just starting a performance connection. Really, what you want to do is start filtering out. You can the direct database connections. If you're using, as Steve was pointing out, there's a few tricks there to kind of fingerprint different types of users coming in. This can be solved with standard database functionality as well as through the DAM itself. Depending on what DAM you have, it gives you a different set of options, but most certainly, yes, it can be done.
Next one. How should we quantify the value of our DAM solution? By the number of databases covered?
This is an interesting question we get quite often, that how do we know that we're actually getting value out of it? There's a couple different approaches. One of the things that we usually try to do first is we talk about something, data under monitoring. And the concept there is, if you take all your databases and add up the kind of the footprint, so how many gigabytes or terabytes each of the databases are, typically your larger databases have the more sensitive data. So a good metric that you can then pass off to the CIO is say, okay, our percentage of data under monitoring is X. So the key there is all you're doing is making a spreadsheet and say, okay, here's all our databases, here's an estimated size of them. Then how many have we already implemented in our DAM solution? So you can kind of say, well, we might have 10 terabytes of data, and 8 terabytes of data have been implemented in our DAM solution that we're monitoring those databases, but the smaller databases, then you may have 1,000 databases, but your top 20 databases or 100 databases account for the vast majority of your data, and that's where you should also focus. Because we see most organizations, well, we have to roll it out to 1,000, it takes us a lot of time to do that. Well, a classic 80-20 rule where 20% of your databases are going to have 80% of your critical data, and then you try to pick off the smaller ones that don't. Is it important to have your data warehouse in your DAM solution versus a small little web application that's sitting off to the side? I would say you need to spend your time focusing in on the most important ones.
All right. Next question. On average, how many FTEs are required to support the DAM?
Usually what we're seeing here is going back to that, if we were to go back to the slide that lays out the ownership there, the care and feeding of the DAM infrastructure as far as not just the appliances, but also thinking through the deployment of agents, and certainly as applications or even tech stacks go through their life cycles and hardware is replaced or databases are moved. There's some ratios that we could talk to on that, but usually, there is a half an FTE at minimum that you're starting to think about. And when you start reaching out as far as the information that is then generated, how many policies and how big are those teams then, and who's making what decisions? If it's something net new, you're going to need more. But if you already have existing, especially if you have a third-party 24/7 security service, some of this can have a smaller impact.
All right. I think we got room for one last question here. We've about reached our time limit. And I love this next one because it says, where can I get Integrigy framework?
Well, the framework is right in front of everyone there as far as the various white papers, all of which are available on Integrigy's website. You can certainly direct people to that, and if there's additional questions with regard to how to implement the framework within their specific environment, more than happy to talk with people about that.
I think it wraps it up for the day then. I thank Mike and Steve for a very educational webinar here on DAM. And don't forget, if you're going to Open World, Steve Coase will be giving a presentation. I believe it's on Sunday. Is that right, Steve?
Yes, Sunday at I think about 2 o'clock.
All right, so be sure to stop by and say hi. If not, have time to actually visit or get to the Steve's presentation itself. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of the week.